Picture this. A woman is standing in the wings of a Broadway theater, hidden behind a thick velvet curtain, wearing a giant hoop skirt and a wig so big it could block traffic. Her heart is slamming against her ribs like a fist on a door. She has done movies. She has done television. She has stood in front of cameras and directors and entire film crews without blinking. But right now, on this particular night, she is more nervous than she has ever been in her entire career. And it is not because of the size of the crowd. It is not because critics are sitting somewhere out there with notepads. It is because two of the most famous women on planet Earth are sitting in the audience, watching her every move, and one of them happens to be considered, by almost everyone alive, the greatest actress who has ever lived. That woman backstage is Betty Gilpin. And this is the story of how a girl who grew up watching her parents perform on stages just like this one ended up living a life so strange and wonderful that she gets mistaken for a British assassin, freezes up at the mention of Meryl Streep, and somehow, through all of it, never stops laughing at herself. Let's rewind, though. Because to understand why this moment backstage mattered so much, you have to go back to where Betty Gilpin actually came from. You have to understand the kind of life that leads a person to a night like that. Betty Gilpin was born in New York City in the summer of 1986. If you know anything about show business families, you already sense where this story is headed. Her father, Jack Gilpin, was an actor. Her mother, Anne McDonough, was an actress too. This wasn't a house where kids grew up dreaming about show business the way outsiders do, imagining velvet ropes and red carpets. This was a house where show business was breakfast table conversation. It was normal. It was the family trade, like other families pass down a bakery or a hardware store. Except instead of flour or nails, the Gilpins passed down monologues and audition nerves and the particular ache of waiting to hear if you got the part. Picture a young Betty, sitting cross-legged on a living room floor, half listening to her parents rehearse lines for whatever show they were currently working on. Picture her soaking in something most kids never get exposed to this early. The rhythm of an actor's life. The uncertainty of it. The joy hiding somewhere underneath all that fear. There's a story Betty has told about her mother that says a lot about the kind of house she grew up in. She's described her mom as somebody who wasn't afraid to be silly, to be a little wild, to lean all the way into physical comedy without worrying about looking foolish. That spirit didn't skip a generation. It planted itself directly inside Betty and grew into something that would define her entire career. A willingness to fully commit. A willingness to make an absolute fool of herself if the scene called for it. That's a rare thing in this industry, where so many performers are terrified of looking silly, terrified of losing their dignity on camera. Betty Gilpin never seemed to care about that. She threw herself into roles headfirst. She studied at Fordham University, earning her degree while also chasing after acting work, the way so many young performers in New York do, balancing classes with auditions, balancing textbooks with headshots. And by the mid-2000s, she was already working. Small parts here and there. The kind of roles most actors have to grind through for years before anyone notices them. A part in an independent film called Death and Love back in 2008. Small television appearances. The slow, patient climb that almost every successful actor has to make before the world finally turns its head and says, "Wait, who is that?" For Betty Gilpin, that moment came in stages. First, there was Nurse Jackie, the Showtime dramedy where she played Dr. Carrie Roman for a couple of seasons in the early 2010s. It gave people a taste of her. A hint of what she could do. But it wasn't the role that made the world stop and stare. That role arrived in 2017. And it changed everything. Netflix released a show called Glow. It stood for Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling, based loosely on a real 1980s women's wrestling promotion. It was a strange, colorful, endlessly entertaining show about a group of misfit actresses who can't find work in Hollywood and end up becoming professional wrestlers instead, throwing on spandex, learning body slams, and finding a strange kind of freedom in the ring that they never found in front of a camera. Betty Gilpin played Debbie Egan, who wrestled under the name Liberty Bell. Here's the thing about Debbie. She wasn't just a punchline. She wasn't just comic relief in a wig and leotard. Debbie was layered. She was a woman whose entire life had fallen apart just before the show begins, whose marriage and career and sense of self had all crumbled at once, and who finds this strange, sweaty, physical outlet for all that rage and grief and confusion. Betty Gilpin brought something ferocious to that role. She was funny, yes, wildly funny, throwing herself into physical comedy with total abandon. But she was also devastating. She could make you laugh in one scene and then absolutely gut you in the next. Audiences noticed. Critics noticed. The Television Academy noticed. Betty Gilpin ended up earning 3 Primetime Emmy nominations for her work on Glow, recognition for playing a character who spent half her screen time flying off the top rope in a wrestling ring and the other half quietly falling apart. Glow ran for 3 seasons before Netflix canceled it in 2019, a decision that still stings fans of the show to this day, especially because a 4th and final season had already been planned and even partially prepared before the cancellation came down. But even in its short run, Glow had done something important. It had introduced the world to Betty Gilpin in a way that made people pay attention. And it had planted the seed for something strange and funny that would follow her for years afterward. Because right around this same time, something odd started happening to Betty Gilpin out in public. People kept stopping her on the street. Not to talk about Glow. Not even to talk about wrestling. They kept congratulating her, with big excited smiles, for a completely different television show. A British spy thriller called Killing Eve. Now, if you've never seen Killing Eve, here's the quick version. It's a show about an intelligence officer chasing after a charming, terrifying international assassin named Villanelle. That assassin is played by an English actress named Jodie Comer. And somehow, in the strange, mysterious math of human faces, enough people out there looked at Betty Gilpin and saw Jodie Comer instead. Imagine that for a second. Imagine walking down a street in New York, minding your own business, and a stranger runs up to you, eyes lit up with excitement, gushing about how amazing you were in a hit British television show. And you have to stand there, slightly confused, slightly amused, and explain that no, actually, that's not me, that's a different actress, we just happen to look alike. This happened to Betty Gilpin often enough that people online actually created a fan account devoted entirely to photos comparing her face to Jodie Comer's. A whole corner of the internet dedicated to 2 blonde, sharp-featured actresses who apparently share some kind of uncanny resemblance. You'd think this might annoy an actress. You'd think being mistaken for someone else, having your own identity blurred with somebody else's fame, might sting a little. But Betty Gilpin didn't react that way at all. When she talked about it publicly, on a podcast interview, she said she was flattered. Genuinely flattered. She talked about how much she admired Jodie Comer's performance on Killing Eve, describing the experience of watching her work as something almost otherworldly. She wasn't threatened by the comparison. She leaned into it, joked about it, and used it as an excuse to gush about a fellow actress whose talent she clearly respected. There's something very telling about that reaction. It tells you the kind of person Betty Gilpin is underneath all the wrestling costumes and hoop skirts and Emmy nominations. She isn't someone who guards her identity like a fortress. She isn't threatened by comparisons or mix-ups. She seems to genuinely delight in the strangeness of show business, in the absurd little accidents of fate that make 2 unrelated actresses look alike enough to confuse half the internet. And honestly, if you stop and think about it, that mix-up says something bigger too. It says something about how good both of these actresses are at their jobs. People weren't confusing 2 random strangers on the street. They were confusing 2 performers who had each done such compelling work that fans felt a genuine emotional connection to them, strong enough that they mistook one beloved face for another. But let's keep the story moving, because Betty Gilpin's career didn't stop after Glow ended. If anything, it kept expanding into stranger and more interesting territory. She jumped into film work, showing up in movies like Isn't It Romantic alongside major stars, and In the Hunt, a darkly satirical thriller that stirred up plenty of headlines when it was first announced because of its provocative premise. She played a nun fighting against artificial intelligence in the science fiction series Mrs. Davis, a show so strange and inventive that it became something of a cult favorite among people who love television that refuses to play by normal rules. She starred in the Starz drama Three Women, playing a character named Lena in a story exploring female desire and identity, a role that pushed her into emotionally raw territory, including intimate scenes that she's openly admitted made her nervous, especially since she was tackling them for the first time after becoming a mother. She kept working. Kept stretching. Kept picking projects that didn't necessarily look like safe, predictable career moves, but instead reflected somebody chasing interesting stories rather than easy paychecks. And then, in late 2024, something happened that would eventually lead her to that terrifying, thrilling night backstage with Meryl Streep sitting in the audience. There was a play running in New York. A strange, unhinged little comedy that had somehow become the hottest ticket in the entire city. It was called Oh, Mary. If you don't know Oh, Mary, here's the setup. It's a farce, written by and originally starring a performer named Escola, imagining a wildly fictional, absurdist version of Mary Todd Lincoln. In this version, Mary Todd Lincoln isn't the buttoned-up historical figure from your textbooks. She's a chaotic, cabaret-obsessed, deeply unstable woman trapped in a suffocating marriage to Abraham Lincoln, desperate to escape into show business, and willing to do increasingly unhinged things to get there. It is absurd. It is filthy. It is hilarious. And audiences absolutely could not get enough of it. The show started small, off-Broadway, at a theater called the Lucille Lortel. It was supposed to run for a limited engagement. Instead, it became a phenomenon. It sold out repeatedly. It extended its run again and again. Word spread through New York theater circles and then out into the wider world that something special, something genuinely bizarre and brilliant, was happening on that stage every single night. Eventually, the production transferred uptown to Broadway itself, landing at the historic Lyceum Theater in the middle of 2024. Once it hit Broadway, Oh, Mary didn't slow down. It kept smashing box office records. At one point, it became the very first production in the Lyceum Theater's entire history, over 100 years of shows, to gross more than $1 million in a single week. It broke its own records again and again throughout its run. It became, by pretty much every measure, one of the biggest hits of the entire Broadway season. But here's the twist in the story. Escola, who wrote the play and originated the title role, always knew they wouldn't stay in the part forever. Eventually, in late 2024, the producers announced who would be stepping into those enormous, chaotic shoes to keep the show running while Escola took a break. That actress was Betty Gilpin. Now, think about what this meant for her. Betty Gilpin had spent nearly 20 years working across television and film. She'd earned Emmy nominations. She'd played wrestlers and nuns and grieving wives and struggling mothers. But she had never once stepped foot on a Broadway stage as a performer. This was going to be her Broadway debut. And not just any Broadway debut. She was stepping into the title role of the single hottest show running in New York City at that exact moment, taking over from the very writer who had created the role and infused it with their own unmistakable comedic voice. When Betty talked about accepting the role, her words practically vibrated with excitement and disbelief. She described watching Escola perform in Oh, Mary before she was ever asked to join the production, saying it had produced one of the hardest laughing fits she'd ever experienced inside a theater. But underneath the laughter, she said she also felt something like reverence, a recognition that she was witnessing something rare and brilliant happening right in front of her. She talked about diving into the role with excitement so big she promised to tell her own 2 daughters about it one day, as if this moment mattered enough to become part of her family's story forever. And speaking of family, there's a detail from this part of her life that ties everything back to where we started. Back to that image of a girl growing up in a house full of actors. When Betty got the call that she'd been cast in Oh, Mary, one of the very first things she did was call her father, Jack Gilpin. Remember him? The actor whose entire life had been built inside the theater world. She told him the exciting news. She was going to make her Broadway debut. And her father asked her a simple question. Which theater? She told him. The Lyceum. There was a pause on the phone. And then her father told her something that must have sent chills down her spine. He told her that back in 1978, decades before Betty was even born, he had made his own Broadway debut in that exact same theater, the Lyceum, working as an understudy in a production called Players. He'd only gone on stage one single night in that role. But it happened. In that building. Under that same roof where his daughter was about to step out under the lights for the very first time. Betty later described how that story stuck with her. She said that any time she felt the fear creeping up, any time the nerves threatened to overwhelm her, especially on that very first night stepping onto the Lyceum stage, she would picture her father standing in that exact same wing decades earlier, his own heart pounding out of his chest, taking his own terrifying leap into the unknown. It gave the whole experience a strange, beautiful, full-circle feeling. Like she wasn't just starting something new. She was continuing something that had been running quietly through her family's blood for generations. Escola gave their final performance in the role on January 19, 2025. And on January 21, Betty Gilpin stepped into the hoop skirt, the wig, the chaos, and became Mary Todd Lincoln for a limited 8-week engagement. Reviews and reactions poured in almost immediately, and audiences seemed thrilled with what she brought to the role. She wasn't simply imitating what Escola had done before her. She was finding her own version of the character's manic, unhinged energy, bringing her own physical comedy instincts, the same fearless willingness to look ridiculous that had defined her work back on Glow years earlier. In interviews around this time, she talked about the show with this kind of giddy, almost disbelieving joy, calling the experience one of the greatest joys of her life. But here's where the story starts building toward that one specific, unforgettable night. As word spread through New York that Betty Gilpin had taken over one of the buzziest roles on Broadway, famous faces started showing up to watch her perform. This is something that happens with hit Broadway shows. Celebrities want to be seen there. They want to experience the thing everyone's talking about. And slowly, night after night, big names started filling seats at the Lyceum Theater to watch Betty Gilpin transform into an unhinged, cabaret-obsessed version of Mary Todd Lincoln. Then came Saturday, March 8, 2025. This was one of the final performances of Betty's limited run before another actor would take over the role. And on this particular Saturday night, the audience wasn't just full. It was stacked with stars. Jennifer Lopez came to watch the show. She wasn't there completely out of the blue either. Betty Gilpin had recently been cast alongside Lopez in an upcoming Netflix film, meaning the two women were already becoming colleagues, already building a working relationship offstage. Lopez brought along Brett Goldstein, another co-star from that same upcoming project, as her date for the evening. But it was who else showed up that night that turned this particular performance into something Betty Gilpin would probably never forget for the rest of her life. Meryl Streep was in the audience too. Let that sink in for a second. Meryl Streep. A woman with more Academy Award nominations than any actor in the history of film. A performer so respected, so towering in her legacy, that her name has basically become shorthand for the very idea of great acting. She showed up that night with her longtime friend Martin Short by her side, the two of them settling into their seats for a night out together at the theater. So picture the scene now. Betty Gilpin, standing backstage before the show, already carrying the nerves that come with performing 8 shows a week in one of the most physically demanding, emotionally chaotic roles on Broadway. And then someone tells her, or she finds out some other way, that out there in the audience tonight, mixed in with the regular theatergoers and tourists and Broadway fans, sits Meryl Streep. For any performer, that kind of news would rattle something loose inside your chest. But for Betty Gilpin specifically, someone who grew up worshipping the craft of acting inside a household built entirely around that craft, someone whose own father had stood in these exact wings decades earlier feeling his heart pound before his one big night, the presence of Meryl Streep in the audience must have felt like something almost mythical. Like a ghost story made real. Like the entire history and weight of American acting had decided to sit quietly in a red velvet seat and watch her work. It's the kind of moment that could make even the most experienced performer's hands shake. And by pretty much every account, that's more or less what happened. Betty Gilpin has talked openly, in various interviews throughout her career, about her tendency to feel nervous, to feel like she might mess everything up, even after years of proving herself capable again and again. She's spoken candidly about anxiety, about the fear that creeps in before big moments, the kind of fear that doesn't necessarily go away just because you've already succeeded before. Now stack all of that fear directly on top of one single, undeniable fact. One of the most legendary actresses alive, someone whose entire career represents a kind of gold standard for the craft Betty had devoted her whole life to, was sitting out there in the dark, watching. Somehow, despite the nerves, despite whatever fluttering panic must have been rattling around inside her chest, Betty Gilpin got out there and did the show. She threw herself into Mary Todd Lincoln's chaos with the same fearless physical comedy that had defined her entire career. She made the audience laugh. She kept the wild, unhinged energy of "Oh, Mary!" alive for one more night, unaware or perhaps painfully aware of exactly who was watching from somewhere in that packed house. And after the curtain came down, after the audience rose to their feet and the applause finally faded, something even more nerve-wracking happened. The stars went backstage. Jennifer Lopez, Brett Goldstein, Meryl Streep, and Martin Short all made their way behind the scenes to say hello to Betty and the rest of the cast. Picture that hallway backstage at the Lyceum Theater, narrow and cluttered the way backstage hallways always are, filled with costume racks and mirrors ringed with light bulbs, and suddenly Meryl Streep is standing there, in person, close enough to actually speak to. Close enough to shake hands with. Close enough to look directly in the eyes. For most performers, meeting someone at that level of legendary status, especially right after finishing a physically and emotionally exhausting performance, adrenaline still pumping, sweat still drying, would be completely overwhelming. It's one thing to admire someone from a distance, through movie screens and awards show broadcasts. It's a completely different experience to suddenly have that same person standing 3 feet away from you, offering genuine praise for the very performance you just gave. Betty Gilpin had spent her entire life around actors. She understood, probably better than most people ever could, exactly how much weight a name like Meryl Streep's carries in this industry. She grew up hearing stories about legendary performers from her own parents. She'd built her whole career worshipping craft and technique and the strange alchemy that turns an ordinary person into an unforgettable character on a stage or a screen. And now here she was, backstage, face to face with arguably the single most celebrated embodiment of everything she'd devoted her life to chasing. It's easy to imagine why someone might describe feeling completely freaked out in a moment like that. Not freaked out in a bad way. Freaked out the way your whole body reacts when something you never quite let yourself believe could happen actually happens right in front of you. The kind of freaked out that comes from colliding directly with your own admiration, your own reverence, standing face to face with a person whose work has shaped your entire understanding of what your career could look like. This wasn't the first time famous faces had shown interest in Betty Gilpin's Broadway run either. Throughout her 8-week engagement, various celebrities and industry figures had made their way to the Lyceum Theater to catch her performance. But this particular night, with Meryl Streep and Jennifer Lopez both sitting in the audience simultaneously, and then both showing up backstage afterward, stood out as something uniquely overwhelming. Two completely different kinds of stardom, both arriving on the same night, both watching the same performer step into this bizarre, beloved role. And here's something worth remembering about the timing of all this. Betty was only about a week away from finishing her run in the show entirely. Titus Burgess was scheduled to take over the role shortly afterward for a limited engagement of his own, before Escola eventually returned to reclaim the part they'd originally created. So this Meryl Streep night arrived right near the very end of Betty's historic run, this incredible 8-week stretch where she had proven, definitively, that she could hold her own on a Broadway stage, could take over one of the buzziest roles in the entire city and make it undeniably her own. Think about the emotional arc of it all. A young girl grows up in a household saturated with acting, absorbing stories about the fear and the thrill of live performance from her own parents. She spends years building a career through small roles and slow, patient climbs. She finally breaks through with glow, earning recognition and acclaim while playing a wrestler falling apart and putting herself back together in the ring. She becomes so recognizable, so beloved in her own right, that fans start mixing her up with another brilliant actress entirely, an accidental testament to just how compelling her screen presence had become. She keeps stretching into stranger, riskier work, nuns fighting artificial intelligence, raw explorations of female desire, unsettling horror films. And then, near the 20-year mark of her career, she gets handed the opportunity of a lifetime. Making her actual Broadway debut, not in some small, forgettable production, but in the single hottest show running in the entire city, taking over a role from the very writer who created it. And on one particular Saturday night, near the very end of that historic run, all of it, the family legacy, the years of hard work, the fear, the triumph, comes crashing together in a single overwhelming moment. Standing backstage, freshly finished with another performance, face to face with Meryl Streep herself. It's the kind of moment that feels almost too perfectly written to be real. Like something out of a movie script. A girl who grew up inside a family devoted to the craft of acting, finally standing in the same room as the person most people consider the greatest practitioner of that exact craft in modern history. And this meeting didn't happen at some industry party, some carefully staged photo opportunity. It happened backstage, sweat still fresh, heart still pounding, right after Betty had proven, one more time, that she belonged exactly where she was standing. There's something beautifully fitting about the fact that this entire journey circles back to family, back to legacy, back to the strange, generational thread running through Betty Gilpin's entire life. Her father stood in that same theater's wings back in 1978, his own heart pounding before his one big performance. Decades later, his daughter stood in those same wings, carrying that same fear and excitement forward, before finally coming face to face with a living legend who represented everything that fear and excitement had been building toward her entire career. Betty Gilpin's story isn't really about fame for fame's sake. If you look closely at everything she said publicly, about being mistaken for Jodie Comer, about her nerves before big moments, about the joy she found stepping into Mary Todd Lincoln's chaos, a clear pattern starts to emerge. This is a performer who never lost her sense of wonder about the craft itself. She never became jaded or cynical about the industry, even after years of experience, even after Emmy nominations and hit shows and a Broadway debut. She still gets nervous. She still gets starstruck. She still feels that flutter of disbelief when something like a fan account devoted to comparing her face to another actress goes viral, or when a living legend like Meryl Streep shows up to watch her perform. And maybe that's exactly why audiences have connected so deeply with her work over the years. There's something profoundly relatable about watching someone who has clearly achieved so much, who has proven herself again and again across television, film, and now Broadway, still carry that same nervous excitement, that same reverence for the people and the moments that matter most to her. She isn't performing confidence for the cameras. She's genuinely, authentically herself, nerves and all, whether she's flying off the top rope in a wrestling ring, whether she's fending off comparisons to a British assassin with grace and humor, or whether she's standing backstage at the Lyceum Theatre, heart still pounding, finally face to face with the woman whose name has become synonymous with acting greatness itself. So the next time you think about what it actually means to make it in show business, don't just picture the red carpets and the award statues and the magazine covers. Picture a woman standing behind a velvet curtain, wearing an enormous hoop skirt, hands shaking slightly, about to walk out onto a stage where her own father once stood decades earlier. Picture her getting through the entire performance despite the fear. And picture the moment afterward, backstage, when all of that fear transforms into something closer to disbelief and joy, as she finally stands face to face with the very person who first taught the entire world what it looks like when acting becomes something close to magic. That's the story of Betty Gilpin. A girl raised inside the world of theater, who spent years chasing her own version of that magic, who found herself accidentally famous for looking like someone else entirely, and who, on one unforgettable Saturday night in March, finally found herself standing in the same room as the woman she'd probably admired since she was that same little girl sitting cross-legged on her living room floor, listening to her parents rehearse their lines, dreaming, even then, of the day she might get to stand in the spotlight herself.